Hello, art seekers. We are here with Aaron Lee Hill today in Brooklyn, in New York City, which is really exciting. I think this is actually our first interview in New York City. So tell me a little bit about you.
I started drawing maybe when I was 4 or 5. Like, I've always drawn since I was pretty young. But at around 11 or 12, I stopped for about 3 years when I got really into skateboarding and just was, you know, kind of the rebellious youth. And actually through skateboarding I got into graffiti, and through graffiti I got into art again. And that's where I started sketching, because I used to draw a lot when I was a kid, but I completely stopped for those years. And oddly enough, through graffiti I would, you know, practice my tags in a sketchbook, and then eventually I would have characters next to my tags, and then more and more the letter form would disappear in my books and on the walls, and the characters would stay. And I sort of re-entered fine art through graffiti.
You do have works of art that are made for the gallery space, but you also see the street as your canvas in many ways too. So tell me a little bit about, do you have the same approach for both practices? Do you see them as separate in your head?
I think when it comes down to it all comes down to space and context. It really is a marriage between the two, between like the graffiti and sort of street art mentality, where I would create works more or less spontaneously in the public realm, but I would also sit and sketch a lot in my books. And then I also spent a year in Europe and then 1 year in Australia, where I was practicing my craft by going to museums and sketching and painting canvases. So it's almost, I've always kind of been cultivating both simultaneously and thinking of both, you know, as part of who I am and part of my vision of where I want to be.
Where do you draw your greatest source of inspiration?
One of my favorite quotes comes from Chuck Close, which is that inspiration is for amateurs, the rest of us just show up for work every day. Because if you spend your whole day expecting and hoping for this inspiration, you won't get anything done.
That's true.
And a lot of times inspiration comes from pushing through. I think I get a lot of inspiration just from the world around me, like everything in general. And some things inspire in a good way, and some things you know, inspire but also make me anxious. And I think the tension between those two emotions is half the reason why I create work. That tension is probably one of the biggest forms of inspiration.
What about animals draw you to them? Do you pick particular animals? I mean, these are all very powerful animals. But can you talk a little bit about your use of...
The main sort of drive that brought me to that in the very beginning was this concept of kind of how egocentric a lot of humanity is, and how we share this planet with billions of other species. But it also comes down to this idea of humans are like one aspect of evolution and the reformation of DNA. And to me, it's like carbon and all the different atoms in the world have been reformed in so many different aspects. And animals to me are like, you know, the other 99% of those formations of DNA that to me have such a strong correlation to life itself, but also to humanity. I mean, we define so much of our world by the creatures and things around us. I mean, like, you know, the earliest forms of technology were you know, manipulating animals. The earliest forms of art were humans relating to the animals that we hunt. And, I mean, there's so many different aspects to me. And the animal, to me, it pulls in all these different aspects at the same time. Where it's not human-centric in the sense that I'm representing creatures that exist in this world that are highly important to ecosystems, but at the same time, it is human-centric because I'm using them as a way to speak about issues around humans. All of humanity right now is in this massive galloping pace that seems to be exploding outwards and literally annihilating this idea of space and time. And there's something very interesting with juxtaposing that idea with a very still object, like an art object, that literally doesn't move. I got influenced by a quote by Faulkner, which was, the aim of the artist is to arrest motion, which to me is the idea of like encapsulating your time period. And like that's always stuck with me.
Do you have a work of art that's kind of like your baby?
There's one mural in Toronto that is in an underpass in the west end of Toronto that's like 120 foot long wall, and I spent quite a while actually just really soaking in the space and trying to think about like, okay, well, what is this wall, and what are the issues that are important here, what can I talk about? It was through the city, and so I had to do community consultation, and so I had a bunch of community members like tell me stories, and it was so nuanced, like all the different aspects of the stories, and then like what the space was. It was basically a turn off from a highway, so you had this basically like a physical barrier of rushing cars all the time, and the highway itself is historically known as a separation point between the waterfront and a lot of the communities, and it was also next to one of the biggest parks in the city. So it had this weird sort of corridor, but also barrier between humanity and nature. And I used that theme to talk about space, and this piece was called Fracture of Space. So it was about how space is fractured, and then how infrastructure and development actually can serve a certain form of the community and, you know, put others literally out on the street, and also sever that connection with nature. These walls, they're public works, and that's what makes them beautiful, is that they're vulnerable. They're vulnerable to everything. They're vulnerable to the elements, they're vulnerable to anyone's opinion, and sometimes their opinion of like stupid little kids who just don't think about it. But to take that away and to treat it almost like a Banksy piece where you put a piece of plexiglass in front and then, you know, immortalize it, it kind of takes away from that fact. And I think that's part of its power.